to Johnny Diamond in Washington, one of our correspondents there. Johnny, can you just update me on what you know about what is happening around the White House?
Well, what we understand now is that much of official Washington has been evacuated. This is because of what have been reports of 3 explosions in the US Capitol. One, which we have obviously confirmed, you've almost certainly seen pictures of. The Pentagon has been attacked. A plane has gone into one side of it. Part of the building has collapsed. There are flames visible in the rest of the building. There are unconfirmed reports of a car bomb outside the State Department, which obviously houses the US Foreign Affairs Department, and also reports of an explosion on the US Capitol, which houses the US Congress. Much of official Washington is now abandoned, evacuated, effectively paralyzed. Staff have been sent home, and security measures are being put in across the US Capitol now. President Bush was supposed to be going back to the White House, journeying back from Florida when he heard about the World Trade Center. That won't be happening anymore. The White House has been evacuated. The security service is patrolling the grounds. We also hear, as you've probably heard, that all flights have been grounded within the United States. Having said that, there are reports, and I can stress there are all kinds of reports now going around, that a second plane is apparently heading for Washington. Completely unconfirmed report, but one which, as you can imagine, is most unhappy news for the authorities struggling to control the situation here in the nation's capital.
Right. Thank you very much, Johnny. And just to underline, Stephen Simon, who worked in the National Security Council on this very issue, said there is no ability to actually shoot down a civilian aircraft. This is what he just told me a moment ago. He's sitting in the studio with me. Let's now go to Rob Watson, who's up Pennsylvania Avenue from the White House in Congress. Rob, go ahead. What's the scene there?
Well, scenes of complete chaos, really, and total gridlock, because, as Johnny Diamond was saying, all the federal buildings have been evacuated. That includes Capitol Hill, it includes all the government buildings, and of course people have just been turfed out onto the streets. Add to that, of course, all the emergency vehicles headed in all directions here in Washington, some to the Pentagon, some here to where I am, just near Capitol Hill, and I think you get some sense of the scene. I think also the streets are packed with people, everybody, of course, talking about what has happened. They seem stunned by this attack on America's capital and the attack just up the road in New York City. People just not knowing what to make of it.
Is there provision in Congress for this kind of evacuation at high speed, for something like this?
Well, it seemed to work pretty effectively, because I was standing just outside Congress when I heard a very loud explosion. Within minutes, the Capitol seemed to be completely evacuated. I spoke to a number of people who worked for Congress. They were streaming out in quite an orderly way, although, of course, looking rather shocked at what they'd seen and at what they'd heard. But I think the evacuation was pretty efficient.
Right, Rob Watson, thanks for joining us from Congress. Now, Stephen Simon is still with me, formerly in the National Security Council until 1999, dealing with this single issue of counterterrorism for President Clinton. What kind of provisions are in place in central Washington for this kind of event, Stephen Simon?
There are extensive provisions for evacuating official Washington. The targets, the chief targets, which are among those that have been attacked in this assault, are fairly hard targets. There is essentially no way to...
You mean physically hard targets?
Physically hard targets, yes.
You mean reinforced,
which is to
hardened.
say they're difficult to attack. The White House is within an 18-acre compound.
But here we're seeing the Pentagon there, smoke rising, part of the building's destroyed. How much of the Pentagon is being destroyed here? How much is below ground?
Well, it seems to me it would be quite difficult to get very close to the Pentagon with a vehicle. It must have been an airplane.
This was a plane. This was a plane which flew into the helicopter pad. Probably a jumbo, we're told, or a large aircraft.
Well, it would have caused significant damage, but bear in mind that the Pentagon is made out of cast concrete, which would be fairly resistant to an explosion, but there is a lot of glass.
And how much deeper does that go, the Pentagon? I mean, there's, 6 or 7 floors, aren't there, below ground?
No, the Pentagon has a couple of basement floors. It doesn't go terribly deep underground. The sensitive facilities are all underground, of course, and I would think would be resistant to attack.
But tell me about the White House, the executive buildings around it, Lafayette Square, the Treasury Building, Congress.
Well, these are buildings that are fairly close together. They're large buildings. The White House itself, as I was saying, is in an 18-acre compound. It's in the center of it. Senior officials who were there, including the vice president, who I understand were there, would have been evacuated immediately into an underground vault, which is completely self-sustaining for a long period of time, and it's quite secure. The facility would have been locked down. The Secret Service counter-assault teams would have been activated. It would have been very, very difficult for anybody to follow up an attack by airplane with some kind of ground assault. But an attack by airplane is definitely possible, and there was one, if you recall.
I do indeed.
It must have been 6 years ago or thereabouts, a small private plane.
And the air defences and the radar were found to be wanting, and people on duty were not as vigilant as they should have been.
Well, actually, in all honesty, I don't recall who was at fault. I do know that it's very difficult to do something about an airplane once it gets close. Again, an airplane can't really be shot down. Just can't do it.
Are you saying there are legal instruments in the United States which forbid any commercial civilian aircraft to be shot down?
Yes. And,
despite all the films which suggest it could happen.
Yes. Well, official Washington pays close attention to those films. They're quite dramatic. Back in '96 in the Olympics, there was a good deal of concern that the Olympic area would have been the subject of an airplane attack. And at that time, security officials reviewed all the regulations and laws quite carefully and were dissuaded at the end of the day from any idea that it would be possible actually to shoot down an aircraft that, for example, was en route to an Olympic facility with the purpose of bombing it or crashing into it.
Right. Stand by, Stephen, for one moment. There have been a series of attacks on the nerve centers of the U.S. administration. 2 planes, civilian aircraft, passenger aircraft, have crashed into the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center in New York. And then a short while later, another aircraft appears to have crashed near the Pentagon in Washington. Both of the 110-story World Trade Center towers have collapsed. Tens of thousands of people work in those buildings. It was the rush hour in the morning. There was also a plane crash of what is believed to be a Boeing 767 near a town about 80 kilometers southeast of Pittsburgh. Well, in many government buildings across the United States, including the White House and Capitol, all staff have now been evacuated. The Federal Aviation Authority has grounded all planes for and closed all airports. There's no word yet on the extent of injuries and deaths in these attacks. Here's an update from Mike Woolridge.
This was the second of the explosions. A plane comes in from the right of the picture and appears to be about to pass behind the South Tower. Next comes a huge explosion with debris showering out from the tower and down towards the streets below as the upper floors are immediately obscured by the billowing smoke. By now, the other tower, the North Tower, was already ablaze at the top as well after being struck by another plane. Eyewitnesses said the planes made no attempt to swerve as they flew towards the buildings. New Yorkers assumed they were reliving the 1993 attack on this, one of the most famous landmarks of the capitalist world. But this was to be infinitely more audacious. There was pandemonium and panic in the streets around the Trade Center. With good reason, as it turned out, for within the hour, one of the huge 110-story towers collapsed, and the surrounding area resembled a war zone.
The first one we didn't see, but my coworker saw the plane hit number 2 World Trade, and we just saw people just falling, jumping out the window. So that's about it.
We were looking at the fire from a distance, and then we saw a few bodies, people just flying out the window. I saw at least four bodies coming through the window. It was a sad day.
But it seemed that with every passing minute there was news that heralded terrorist action on an even bigger scale. The reports of aircraft being hijacked, and then this, a plane crashing onto a helicopter landing pad close to the Pentagon in Washington, the heart of the US defense establishment. This was the scene afterwards. Later came reports of a car bomb outside the State Department. The White House was evacuated and all planes across the country were grounded. But New York had not seen the last of the apocalyptic events there. The second of the World Trade Center towers collapsed, burying yet more of the city's financial district under rubble. It's still impossible to calculate the number of victims of these unbelievable, virtually simultaneous attacks. Mike Wooldridge, BBC News.
President George W. Bush was in Florida, and he had this to say.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is a difficult moment for America. I, unfortunately, will be going back to Washington after my remarks. Secretary Rod Page and Lieutenant Governor will take the podium and discuss education. I do want to thank the folks here at Booker Elementary School for their hospitality. Today, we've had a national tragedy. 2 airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Center in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. I have spoken to the Vice President, to the Governor of New York, to the Director of the FBI, and have ordered that the full resources of the federal government go to help the victims and their families, and to conduct a full-scale investigation to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence. May God bless the victims, their families, and America. Thank you very much.
Well, despite earlier reports, the Democratic for the Liberation of Palestine have denied being behind the attack.
The DFLP has no relation to this accident or this incident. We have always been against terroristic actions, against civilian targets, and especially outside the occupied territories. But in spite of that, we deny our responsibility, but we call upon the American administration to review their attitude and their policy towards the Palestinian question, because this policy arouses the anger and the hatred of our people and of all Arab and Islamic peoples, and it's liable actually to harm the interests of the United States in our region, and therefore it has to be reviewed.
Let's now go to Washington for the latest there to Stephen Sfeach. Stephen.
Well, the latest here in Washington is that a plane has crashed into the Pentagon, or at least into part of the Pentagon. Part of the building has collapsed and is on fire. We also know there's been a bomb explosion outside the State Department, a car bomb. Government buildings have been evacuated. Federal employees have flooded out into the streets. The U.S. Capitol, the Congress building, also evacuated. And meanwhile, of course, in New York, a tragedy on what seems to be a terrible scale. 2 planes have crashed into both the towers of the World Trade Center, and those 2 towers have collapsed, and it's feared with heavy loss of life.
And the scene across the nation, what's the atmosphere?
I think an atmosphere of great shock. What's happened throughout the morning here has been that one piece of bad news has followed another. So first of all, we had the attack on the World Trade Center, then developments here in Washington, and now these reports, which now have been confirmed on at least 2 news agencies, that a 747 jetliner has crashed on a flight from Chicago to New York. It's crashed in Pennsylvania. So I think a sense of great shock, people simply almost unable to believe what's going on, and a great sense of vulnerability and a sense that there is somebody out there, wherever it is, who is determined to attack US targets.
And we are getting reports, unconfirmed at this stage, that there is somewhere up there another aircraft which is heading somewhere. Stephen.
I can't confirm that. What I can tell you is that all transatlantic flights have been diverted to Canada, so no flights from across the Atlantic or from coming in to the United States at the moment. All US commercial flights have been grounded, and therefore, if there is a plane out there, it will stick out like a sore thumb, and I think the authorities will be pretty worried.
There, the scene at the World Trade Center. And I have to tell you, Stephen, as the tower collapses there, the most horrendous image. And we have to think of the people who were in there and around the bottom of the building at that time, as all that rubble, masonry, steel collapsed as you are watching it there.
Yes, I think perhaps the one element of hope, I was listening earlier to the people who had been inside the building. It seems that at least a lot of the people who were inside the building on the lower floors were able to make their escape after the plane attack and before the buildings collapsed. But of course there would have been people perhaps still trapped in there, and people on the ground who may have been hit, and of course it's quite possible, according to at least one TV network here, many people on board those two planes as well.
Stephen Sveach in Washington, thank you. You can see behind this eyewitness the towers still standing. One of the towers, those towers are no more after the impact of the two hijacked aircraft, both within about an hour and a half, collapsed to the ground in South Manhattan.
People jumping out. People just kept jumping and jumping and jumping. And you could still see they were alive because they were flailing around.
Now, just let me clarify something that Stephen said about transatlantic flights being diverted to Canada. It has just been reported by the Reuters news agency that Canada has now shut all airports. That's according to the Transport Ministry in Ottawa. Now, Stephen Simon, you were in the White House for 6 years. Your job was counterterrorism for President Clinton until 1999. Here you are sitting horrified watching all this. I have to ask you, was any of this preventable? Or, after all, think back to Oklahoma City. The initial assumption was this was terrorism with a Middle East connection. It was found to be Stephen McVeigh. Should we assume this is Middle East terrorism?
There are a number of possible candidates, Nick. Middle East terrorists are one of them. One thing that's obvious from this attack is that the terrorists wanted to destroy symbols of American power, authority, prestige. Leadership targets, as well as buildings that signified the financial might of the United States.
I'm talking about the coordination here, Stephen.
I just need to complete this point, which is that Timothy McVeigh represented exactly this motivation. Now, having said that, so does Osama bin Laden. And what's striking about this attack is that it was against several targets and it was coordinated in a simultaneous fashion. This is right out of bin Laden's playbook. And it's also very consistent with bin Laden's rhetoric.
But let me just press you on this, Stephen, because in the end we are talking about 4 planes apparently hijacked in a coordinated way. That's more than Timothy McVeigh, isn't it?
It is more than Timothy McVeigh. All I'm saying is that jumping to the conclusion that this is Islamic terrorism is unwarranted at this point, as tempting as it is. And I can give you reasons why it's tempting.
Please do.
I was talking about bin Laden's rhetoric. It is extremely forceful and uncompromising. A videotape was recently released. It was a hodgepodge of videotapes previously made of bin Laden. But it was assembled and distributed not long ago, and in it, bin Laden reiterated his call for jihad against the United States and reiterated his determination to strike out against American power and arrogance as he perceives these things. Secondly, there is a determination here to cause large casualties. Now, this was clearly a concern of Timothy McVeigh's, but it's also a chief concern of the groups that have gathered themselves around bin Laden to target the United States. These groups are looking to cause huge numbers of casualties, and they've tried it on a number of occasions. They've tried it against the World Trade Center, in fact. So there's another reason why one might think, well, this is in bin Laden's playbook. And then there's the coordination that we discussed a minute ago. When he attacked the embassies in East Africa, it was done in a coordinated way, and it was actually very impressive to counterterrorism officials.
And of course, some of those who were charged with the incident in Nairobi were arraigned in a court in Manhattan.
They were arraigned in a court in Manhattan. Well, it's interesting, actually, that you mentioned that court in Manhattan, because the transcripts of the East Africa bombing trial reveal connections between Ramzi Youssef, the conspirator who attempted to destroy the towers a number of years ago, with Osama bin Laden. Apparently, there was a connection there.
When you were sitting in the National Security Council, and you've said half an hour ago when you first joined us that this really is the scenario from hell, the doomsday scenario that none of you ever wanted to even contemplate, even watching it in a movie. Did you ever, before you left in 1999, see similar intent where you were able to steer the terrorists away, stop terrorism before it happened? In other words, you got wind of it.
Yeah, there was one case in particular which was extremely frightening and thwarted only at the last minute, and that was an attempt to destroy as many as 11 or 12 747s, American flag carriers, over the Pacific, more or less simultaneously. A plot dreamed up and almost brought to fruition by the very man who attempted to destroy the World Trade Center in 1994.
And when was that?
That was in '96.
So this, you're saying, and we have to speculate here, fits a pattern?
Well, it does. I mean, if you look back at that plot to destroy the 747s, it was an attempt to cause as many as 4,000 casualties in different places, more or less simultaneously. So you had the coordination, the synchronization, and the attempt to generate mass casualties, and the attempt to destroy symbols of American power and, in this case, ubiquity, because American aircraft are all over the place.
Here we're seeing Palestinian celebrations somewhere in the Middle East, a degree of joy. I think I heard you correctly, and just underline this if you can, Stephen. You did say an attempt to blow up 12 jumbo jets simultaneously in the Pacific in 1996.
Yeah, that's correct.
So we've had now incidents involving 4 hijacked aircraft. This does begin to fit a pattern.
Yes, and again, in official Washington, there will, I am sure, be a reluctance to leap to the obvious conclusions. Nothing could be worse. If you start looking at the obvious suspects and miss the groups that might actually have been responsible. So I do not think that there will be a rush to judgment. Hopefully, evidence will emerge quickly on the basis of whatever knowledge can be gleaned about the actual hijackers.
Now, you keep your contacts in Washington. You're still across this kind of thing. If you had to list in bullet points for the president why someone would do what we're seeing there in South Manhattan, the World Trade Center hit by 2 hijacked planes, why would you say briefly that this has been done?
In the real world, that would not be in a memo to the president right now, because nobody would want to put down on paper or go to the president with that sort of speculation.
Well, why is this being done? What's the political advantage?
You've raised a key point, Nick. The absence of a political advantage. This kind of attack is not part of some bargaining scenario. This kind of attack isn't staged to gain leverage or to press an opponent to make certain concessions, around a negotiating table. There is no, strictly speaking, political motivation here. What we're seeing here is pretty much unrefined, profound hatred and desire to kill. Now, perhaps in a certain sense that's political, but more than likely the underlying motivation is religious in some way.
Right, Stephen Simon, you've been listening to the voice of Stephen Simon, who until 1999 was President Clinton's advisor on counterterrorism in Washington in the National Security Council. And while you were speaking there, Stephen, American Airlines, the giant flag carrier in the United States, confirmed it has lost 2 aircraft with 156 people on board. We know 2 more aircraft have been involved. One was a United Airlines 737, and we believe a 4th airliner of undetermined identification has crashed 80 miles from Pittsburgh in southern Pennsylvania. Reports from the scene, from the 911 service and from the emergency services suggest it was a jumbo jet, although one other report did suggest it was a Boeing 767, which is smaller than a Boeing 747, which is the original name for a jumbo. Right, let me now go to the Middle East, to Orla Guerin in Jerusalem. Orla, it's now 2.5 hours since the first incident in southern New York. Can you tell me what the feeling is at the moment where you are?
Well, the response here really has been one of absolute shock and complete horror. People here have been watching the events unfolding on television with a sense of disbelief. We know that within the last 10 minutes or so, Israel's Prime Minister Ariel Sharon has phoned President Bush to offer his condolences. Israel is also putting together a medical team, emergency specialists from the Israeli army, who of course have plenty of experience of their own of dealing with the aftermath of terrorist attacks, and they should be on their way to the United States this evening. We've also had condemnation from the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. He described the events as completely shocking, unbelievable, said the Palestinian people too were sending their sympathy to the United States. Now, we have perhaps had a more interesting development, which is contacts taking place between the CIA and the Israeli intelligence establishment. Obviously, America is calling all its allies now, trying to find out any information that anybody may have, any kind of speculation, any hints as to who was behind this. Now, we are still in the realm of speculation. Everybody obviously is feeling around in the dark, but Israeli sources are actually pointing the finger away from Palestinian militant groups and suggesting that they attach some importance to the possibility that the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden was involved. Israeli radio is reporting that senior sources say there was a credible threat from Osama bin Laden, that there would be a major series of attacks, unprecedented attacks, not only on American interests but also on British ones. That's the Israeli version of that story. And we do know also that journalists in London who have had close contact with Osama bin Laden, Arab journalists, say that he made this claim also to them, that he would carry out a series of spectacular attacks of the kind never seen before. So that report is being treated here with some seriousness by the Israeli defense establishment.
Orla, stand by. Let's now hear the words of Yasser Arafat when he heard the first news of the first incident at the World Trade Center in New York.
To the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Right, that's the view from the Palestinian side. Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World. First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it is a kind of bin Laden organization, and even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror. The same kind of struggle that our forefathers launched against the piracy on the high seas.
In your position as Prime Minister, Defence Minister, also formerly in the Army, were you ever aware of any incident planned like this?
Not in the dimensions, but different elements where there clearly there was an attempt on the Twin Towers few years ago, there was an attempt to explode the Holland tunnel leading into Manhattan. But of this size and a simultaneous attack, I don't think that anyone had predicted it in advance.
Is it something that security services, intelligence services,